We thought we'd jump right into it. We have 3 speakers today. We're going to go in order, Andrea, Niha, and Ines. We thought we'd do the presentations back to back and then just open it up to a conversation for about 40 minutes or so. Cool? Great. Andrea, the floor is yours.
I'll take this giant stage. Okay, why? Okay, hello, all right. Okay, so thanks a lot for this opportunity to the organizers. My talk today introduces my current project that I started in February. I will be doing it for the next 3 years, supported by a fund by the Dutch Research Council. And the overall project is called Recoding Values in the Digital Economy. And what I speak about here today is a particular iteration of such recoding of values in what I call crypto statecraft. I would like to see this talk as an invitation to anyone here who feels some resonance, is working on similar issues. I already have 2 collaborators here next to me on the panel. But indeed, because I'm at the beginning of the project, it would be very nice if anyone feels that they want to reach out and talk about things together. On the left side here, you see a photo that I took at the first conference on the so-called network state, held in Amsterdam last October. It was a gathering of about 1,000 tech enthusiasts, almost exclusively men, with a bit of a country club vibe, I would say. The concrete term network state was coined by a tech entrepreneur and investor, Balaji Srinivasan, in a book that he published in 2022. By his own one-sentence summary, a network state is a highly aligned online community with a capacity for collective action that crowdfunds territory around the world and eventually gains diplomatic recognition from pre-existing states. Okay, his proposition hardly lends itself for serious consideration by international lawyers. However, it does lend itself to inquire about modes of governance beyond the state. By now, there are various new names and concepts describing the phenomenon of digital communities that aspire to organize themselves relatively autonomously, such as networked sovereignties or coordinations. A key ingredient in these propositions fueling this claim to autonomy and decentralization is blockchain technology and cryptocurrencies. In these projects, blockchains become jurisdictions, meaning they become a form of ordering that aspires to replace, or as my colleague Delphine Dogo and I have recently called it, augment law. So in what follows, I would like to embed this phenomenon in what I believe to be a larger trend of a crisis of values and challenges to the nation state as the only form for social ordering on a large scale. We experience a crisis of values both in the sense of increased inequalities, but also in the sense of ecological degradation to life-threatening levels. And whereas such questions were mainly negotiated through the lens of rights mediated by nation states, the state as a guarantor for an equitable distribution and successful mediation for thriving societies has lost its trust. But to move step by step, think back to the early days of the pandemic. People showed their gratitude for care workers by applauding from their balconies. Everyone recognized the invaluable work of these healthcare professionals. However, despite this widespread appreciation, the care sector remains underfunded and care workers are poorly paid. Similarly, there is a clear and shared understanding that the planet is burning. Yet, pollution continues in unprecedented levels, forests are being logged at a breathtaking speed, and about 150 species are lost on a daily basis. Experts of various disciplines argue that one of the main issues lies in our narrow definition of value, which is limited to the price mechanism. In other words, we assess value based solely on what someone is willing to pay. The problem, they argue, is that the price mechanism does not reflect social and ecological values. And to put it with the words of Mark Carney, the former governor of the Bank of England and the UN Special Envoy for Sustainable Finance, The embrace of markets and their subjective valuations has led to a society that has been robbed of its capacity to express what is important to us. This inability to express what is of value on the societal level is closely connected to the current challenges to the nation-state. In a recent publication, Nihal Butta advances the argument that social rights, or as he calls them, natural social rights, should not be read as a weak offspring of a social welfare state, but that they helped articulate and motivate the concept of the state as a public power that must organize the economy in order to ensure a society of equals. What stands out in Butta's account is that the social and economic inequality what stands out is that that social and economic inequalities form a demand in forging the very form of the state. So the rights don't come secondary, they come, so to speak, primary to the state form because of a need for social and economic forging. And so for a long time, the idea that then wealth would trickle down held a credible promise towards social mobility. However, we are now seeing that the normative and social consequences of rising inequality are trickling up and are reshaping all dimensions of normal politics, as Butta puts it. So, we are confronted with a Gretchenfrage. Nun sag, wie hast du's mit dem Staat? The question of the role of the state, or rather possibilities of organizing beyond the state for enabling collective futures, is being discussed across many disciplines, and I am offering this selection of books here to give you a sense of where I draw from. As mentioned before, the starting point is a historical contextualization of the current state form. Historian Charles Meyer aptly called this state the project state. And this claim resonates with Butta's argument that the state has become a field for projecting rights claims. So what then are the rivals of the project state? With James Scott, I can perform an anarchist squint to try and see them. Scott suggests that the focus on the state and liberal economics for more than 2 centuries has ossified our capacity to think of society through any other framework. Leviathan, as he says, may well have given birth to its own justification. So it is not the Hobbesian state of nature that is in the way of societal transformation. It is the knowledge and the ordering system of the Hobbesian Leviathan that has become so deeply ingrained in the West that we can't imagine anything outside of it anymore. Octavia Butler's work is phenomenal in many ways, but what I would like to include here is a quote from her science fiction novel, The Parable of the Sower. Her main character says, "And yet we know a lot, the 5 of us. We know how to do a great many things. There must be a way to put it all together and make us something other than domestic servants looking for room and board. We make an interesting unit." This quote on making an interesting unit expresses something profound about my own intuitions on the possibility of transformations toward more equitable ways of living and where to even start looking for them. The fact that people know how to do a great many of things and that there must be a way to put it all together and make us more than domestic servants lies at the core of any prospect for transforming societies. The lightness of the formulation expresses precisely the depth at which the question is asked. Layers and layers of critiques of capitalism, racism, religion, gender, the economy, etc., of course, responded to this question in endless ways of showing how and why structural constraints have come into being and how they make it so that we live with the most incredible injustices on a daily basis without much hope for changing them. In acknowledging this complexity, in an interview in 1993, Butler said, "One of the reasons I made my character a teenager when she begins all this is because only a teenager would be dumb enough to try to start such a thing. And only a teenager would have any chance of succeeding, just because she doesn't know how impossible the situation is." So by setting her teenager up to do it, Butler insists that there's something very powerful in the everydayness of community and of joining forces for building a future amidst the violence in the world. So now let me come back to crypto statecraft. What you see on the slide here is a very small selection of currently existing iterations of different forms of networked sovereignties. Each of these communities relies on blockchain technology for their functioning, and yet these projects have very different political motivations, are constituted by very different communities, and dream of very different futures. The propositions cover the full spectrum of non-state-based political orientations. The loudest and best funded are certainly the libertarians. However, there are also communities that try to develop crypto commons and other forms of alter economies. Much more can be said about each of these projects, but in this short talk, I simply want to outline the two affordances of blockchain technology that make it so relevant for governance experiments beyond the state. So first, blockchain technology offers any group the possibility to collectively create, manage, and distribute funds, cryptocurrencies or any other tokens, without having to incorporate as a legal entity. These new forms of social organizing on the blockchain are commonly known as DAO, a decentralized autonomous organization. One of the first definitions of a DAO comes from Ethereum founder Vitalik Buterin, describing DAOs as long-term smart contracts that contain the assets and encode the bylaws of an entire organization. In more simple terms, with the definition of the World Economic Forum, a DAO is a general term for a group that uses blockchains and related technologies to coordinate its activities. Importantly, in their independence from state-based legal institutions, they have a certain proto-legality to them, or a form of legal engineering beyond the state. And even though there are attempts at categorizing DAOs with a market capitalization of approximately 29 billion US dollars and more than 4,000 DAOs, any such attempt will remain partial. But it's the ambiguity of categorization and the impossibility of keeping up with the latest developments that marks DAOs as an active and dynamic governance experiment that attracts people and capital. The second reason for studying DAOs is their explicit relationship to encoding values. The launch of the first blockchain protocol, Bitcoin, was explicitly tied to developing a peer-to-peer digital payment system. Since then, blockchain-native tokens are at the heart of the success of the space, if you call it a success. Skyrocketing and dramatically declining cryptocurrencies have intrigued and dismayed many participants and observers. The question underwriting these activities, however, remains real. What is money and who gets to distribute it on what grounds? Any blockchain protocol and decentralized app built on it can be seen as an experimental answer to this question. The key here is so-called token economics, a mode of governance that is based on token-driven incentive structures. So taken together, the independent code-driven architecture and the ability to encode values in novel ways turns blockchains into governance-making machines, where the protocol is the institution. Let me close with an artwork and a quote by one of the most astute voices in the crypto space, artist Rhea Meyer. She says, "DAOs and the blockchain in general are indexes of our contemporary economic imaginary. In contrast to entrenched economic systems, they are novel and public, so we can see them and reflect on their functioning and effects. The making explicit of value and values, structured both in terms of financial and behavioral incentives, and the language and meaning-making of their participants is what gives DAOs such epistemological, ontological, and aesthetic potential." And with this, thank you very much. I'm looking forward to the discussion. How do we need to change here?
second. Okay, good afternoon, everyone, and a big thank you to the organizers. A big thank you to the organizers for including me in this fantastic conference, and especially on this panel because I get to meet old friends. I think it's a very glamorous venue, and we rarely feel glamorous as an academic. So it's almost nerve-wracking how glamorous this venue is. So what I want to share with you today is a project that I'm working on, and it's very much a work in progress, but it's basically what I'm trying to do through this project is to understand how we can really figure out a way of operationalizing this idea of regulatory interoperability, and I'm looking at it from the perspective of international law, particularly international economic law. So there are a few points that I want to emphasize through this presentation. The first thing that I want to do is to talk a little bit about what I think the value add of regulatory interoperability would be, and the way I present it in my paper is as a building block for the global digital economy. Second, I want to look at some examples of emerging approaches to regulatory interoperability, which I think are already there. And I look at some of the prospects that they offer, but also some of the challenges that come with that. And given this context, in the third point I want to focus is on how we can embed certain aspects of regulatory interoperability in international economic law. And I focus quite a bit on flexibility, bottom-up, and multi-layered responses that are necessary in order to do so. A few months ago, I was in a conference in Washington where quite a few people were talking about interoperability, and in a very characteristic frank style, one of the persons who was there in the audience from the US administration asked, what the hell is interoperability? So I think that's quite a big question really to start with. And I think the context of interoperability for my project is also important, which is that we live in a world which is hyper-connected, but also where there is hyper-regulation. And when I thought of interoperability, a logical choice was to go to computing sciences because that's where this term is used a lot. And certain elements that you find in computing sciences, I took those and I tried to translate that in a regulatory context in terms of looking at the digital economy. So the first thing that I think in terms of looking at regulatory interoperability, the content of regulatory interoperability was to look at the norms, the guidelines, and the principles that are necessary to operationalize it. And second, the institutions. But in order to be able to do all that, it's important to also find the common regulatory goals and interests for different regulatory frameworks to be workable with each other, to be able to interoperate with each other. So what lies actually at the heart of the project is to find out what the shared regulatory goals between countries could be. And that's basically the starting point of the project. Now, once you know, the main question then is why really get into this idea of regulatory interoperability? For people who work in this space, this is a term that is often thrown around. But the first thing then for me was to just figure out what the value add is. So the first thing I thought about was, well, it's very difficult to navigate different regulatory preferences that countries have when it comes to digital regulation. And this could be a possible framework to navigate some of these differences. The second thing was, it is quite clear, even when we look even at the presentations that have been made here today, that when it comes to digital and data regulations, thinking of a harmonized framework is very difficult. And in that context, the idea of regulatory interoperability actually moves away from harmonization to more shared, to figuring out ways which are more pragmatic and which also take into account that different countries might have different value systems. So what I propose in the paper is not really perfect symmetry or alignment between regulatory system, but rather a way of them working with each other based on very practical needs. And an area where this has potential to be tested is cross-border data flows, which is what I also look at in the paper. Now, there are certain basic advantages of this idea. It can reduce jurisdictional conflicts. It can enable cross-border enforcement, which is quite difficult on different aspects of digital regulation. It can address some of the market entry barriers, and it can also because the whole system that can come out of it is very flexible and pragmatic, it can accommodate a lot of digital disruptions. But on the other hand, there are obvious challenges, which I also raise in the paper. There could be seen as a threat to digital sovereignty. There are many transactional costs, including for smaller countries and also for smaller companies. And there's also a lot of uncertainty as to determining shared goals in any realm of digital regulation. And then there are problems of industry capture, which also I highlight. But in addition to industry capture, it could also be that certain powers have more say in many of these matters and some lesser so. So when I started looking at the emerging practices in regulatory interoperability, I picked a lot of examples I've picked in the paper are in relation to cross-border data flows, specifically personal data flows, and the ones marked in asterisks all relate to that. For those of you who are familiar with GDPR, a lot of these things are probably things you've seen: adequacy mechanism, codes of conduct, model contractual clauses, data certification mechanisms, and the paper looks at some of these evolving mechanisms, both the strengths and the weaknesses. But it is also important to remember there are many examples outside the European context. The APEC is another example where there is a cross-border privacy rule system which allows for data transfers. The data ethics seal is a data security mechanism which was developed in Denmark, and essentially it allows again for more interoperability in terms of dealing with some of the data security issues. And the other aspect of interoperability that I look at in the paper is in the context of digital economy agreements, which is, for some of you, maybe a completely unfamiliar territory. They're basically new kinds of treaties that some countries are signing, which specifically look at the digital economy. They are somewhat like trade treaties, but not really, because they're just focused on digital trade. And they often cover issues which are well beyond the scope of traditional trade treaties. But they have very interesting provisions on interoperability. A lot of it is focused on technical interoperability of different frameworks. But what I argue in the paper is that it's also possible to look at different dimensions of regulatory interoperability. And this is not just about data flows, but they also look at things like e-payments or different kinds of digital trade facilitation measures. Now, the last point, which is on how to really embed then this whole idea of regulatory interoperability within the international legal framework. So for me, this is the most difficult part of the question, because yes, it is an elegant idea to have some kind of interoperability because it is practical, it respects regulatory differences across countries. But as I mentioned, they have a lot of possible deficiencies. They can be inefficient, they can be expensive. It's also possible that in certain areas, regulatory goals can be very difficult to identify, especially among countries that might have very, very different political systems. So in terms of operationalizing interoperability, the first thing what I propose is what is known as interoperability checks, which is basically a very detailed regulatory mapping exercise where you decide what are the different countries where you want to achieve interoperability. And a lot of this has been done, for instance, in the context of the EU and US and personal data flows. But the paper proposes other areas where this is necessary. And also looking at the risk analysis element, which is equally important, which is, for instance, national security risk, which is very topical these days, but also in addition, considerations of human rights that might be relevant. In certain areas, maybe the optimum level of interoperability might be much lesser, and in certain areas it might be much higher. The other aspect that the paper really pushes on is inclusivity and representativeness, both of countries, but also institutions and procedures. And this is particularly a problem with standard setting, where often a lot of standards that become the basis of technical interoperability in the past have been mostly driven by certain big private players. But it could also be a problem in terms of regulatory interoperability, where some of the biggest institutions which are behind this could be organizations such as the OECD, which might be based in richer countries, which basically a membership of richer countries and might therefore exclude other countries. Here, I think a lot of regional interventions are quite interesting, and one example I highlight quite a bit in the paper is ASEAN and how they have been working on different approaches. The other thing that I also highlight in the paper is how a modular approach might work. This is building on some of the theories in organized. So there's people like Ness and others who have built some of these approaches in organizational theory and particularly applied it to internet governance, where you take specific areas, and then you divide them into specific sub-issues, find the right experts, and then you build each module one by one and then see how they can all come together in a more coherent framework. I think it's also important from the perspective of regulatory interoperability to distinguish this from a benchmarking exercise where you decide what is the best principle and then you start benchmarking each domestic regulation in context of that specific principle. One aspect that I highlight in my paper also is that we often focus on technical interoperability and in that context talk about technical standards and some of the best practices that are necessary. But in terms of also thinking of regulatory interoperability, they can really go in hand. So for instance, if you want to have a data exchange system, which allows for technical interoperability, you also need some regulatory consensus on for instance, what the data classification mechanism should be in a particular context. So in that sense, the whole idea of regulatory interoperability, therefore, is quite practical. It can be in specific domains. It can be in specific areas. Now, in terms of what the role of international law would be, particularly international economic law, there's some proposals that I make in the paper, and some of this is already being done in practice. If you look at some of the new generation, especially digital trade rules in some of the recent trade agreements, one is incorporating the relevant frameworks by reference. So, for instance, a lot of other bodies might be building maybe in the standard setting space, in the internet governance space, to incorporate all those relevant frameworks by reference. Using soft law and informal law, in many instances, treaty-based mechanisms might be less successful, and therefore soft law and informal law might be a good mechanism. Another thing that I propose in the paper is more cross-border sandboxing, and I've given some examples, particularly again from the ASEAN region, where essentially what has been done is regulatory interoperability. And this is keeping in mind that ASEAN is a very diverse region of countries with very different levels of digital development, involving more non-trade institution and experience of IOs. And particularly, there are quite a few IOs who have dealt very well with non-state actors and building on co-regulatory models. And finally, another thing that the paper pushes towards is to look at the work of more transnational regulatory bodies, particularly the examples I discuss are Global Privacy Assembly and the International Competition Network. Now, of course, all this means that we are going to look at international law very differently, because so far we've looked at international law mostly from a treaty-based perspective. This is a much wider way of looking at the role of international economic law in this in the regulation of global digital markets. But the paper basically suggests that this might be a more flexible and pragmatic way of accommodating the diversity of regulatory preferences that countries have when it comes to participating in the global digital markets. So to conclude, I think the first point, again, regulatory interoperability, the way I conceptualize it in the paper, distinguishing it from technical interoperability is more about norms, guidelines, and best practices, and institutions and mechanisms that can be developed based on shared regulatory goals. The idea here is to try reduce the tension and friction between different layers of regulation or different layers of institutions that exist in different domains of digital regulation, rather than coming up with a harmonized or a uniform framework. The second point that I wanted to highlight through the examples that I discussed is that they have to be made more robust and inclusive. And I'm happy to discuss some of the examples later on in the discussions. And finally, in terms of the role that international law has to play, I think there is a lot of scope for experimenting with regulatory interoperability, especially in the context of building global digital markets. But that might mean looking at international law slightly differently, or maybe very differently, being more experimental, more flexible, and being more open to new forms of new kinds of networks that can be help build consensus on many of these issues. So this is a summary of all my points, and thank you very much.
From over here. Yes. Okay, hi everyone. I will add some more questions to the debate rather than answers, but I do think the answers to some of my questions can partially be found in what Nia had discussed so far. So today I'd like to discuss the future of crypto assets under WTO law specifically. Yes, so when we talk about, I don't know how well versed everyone is when it comes to crypto, blockchain. It usually scares people a little bit. It still scares me, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't talk about it. And scares me in the sense of, I'm actually not sure what this means. But there's a lot of associations with crypto, right? So when we look at an ordinary person who follows the news, when they hear the term crypto, they can think many things. They can think speculation, volatility, spectacular collapses, where FTX is one of the most recent spectacular collapses with the societal fallout that we've seen. Allegations and convictions of fraud. Blockchain, and what is actually blockchain? NFTs, and excuse my French, but what the hell are NFTs and where do they get their value? The opportunity of quick financial gain is also maybe a more positive association with crypto. And then there's people who might just think crypto, that's decentralized finance. I know what I'm talking about. So that's what I think, and there's many other examples, I'm sure, but that's some of the associations for, let's say, normal people. Then there's regulators who hear these associations, who maybe make the same associations and think, okay, there's a need for regulation. There seems to be a lot of things that can go wrong with crypto, so let's regulate. Then there's a trade lawyer who hears that there's new regulation and thinks, okay, but if there's new regulation of something that is traded internationally, traded across borders all the time, let's maybe think about the trade law implications. So that's where we're at. As a trade lawyer, I thought it would be interesting to think a bit more about the position of crypto in international trade. For those that are not super well aware of the negotiations that are ongoing in the digital trade sphere, there's initiatives at the WTO. There's many bilateral and regional agreements that have now started to talk a bit more about digital trade, and where countries have started making new commitments, new obligations. But crypto, blockchain, distributed ledger, cryptocurrencies have been missing from that discussion so far. For the purpose of my presentation, I will talk about crypto assets. Most people, I think, are familiar with cryptocurrency. Cryptocurrency is an example of crypto assets. I really like the definition. So there's no internationally agreed definition of crypto assets. There's no internationally agreed taxonomy of what constitutes crypto assets, which of course also makes the whole discussion a bit more complicated. But I really like the definition that the IMF proposes, which is a digital representation of value that relies on cryptographically secured distributed ledger to validate and secure transactions. So basically, digital representation of value. Question is, why drag international economic law into this? And actually, the slide should say, why drag international trade law into this? Because you might think the IMF is the international organization that deals with international monetary policy. So that should be the forum where we discuss crypto. But I would argue that there's definitely also an international trade aspect to this. Crypto and distributed ledgers are, of course, completely digital and cross-border. The whole idea of crypto is that we have this decentralized finance that is accessible to everyone from anywhere in the world. The only thing you need is access to the internet. So this quintessential digital and cross-border nature, of course, also implies that crypto-related services, whether we're talking about the issuing of cryptocurrency, whether we're talking about crypto exchanges, crypto wallets, whatever kind of service you can imagine that's related to crypto, is supplied across borders. It's supplied from a service supplier wherever in the world to any other country. So it's truly a global industry, and I don't think anyone is contesting that. But of course, that means that we are talking about trade and services, international trade and services, and we have quite an elaborate framework that applies to international trade and services. So that's why I want to drag international trade law into this. We see that there's more and more regulation. So as the first slide already explained or prefaced, regulators are more and more understanding or convinced, let's put it like that, convinced that there's a need for regulation, that there's a need to protect consumers, there's a need to put limits on kind of this decentralized finance, which of course goes against the whole idea of crypto. But regardless of that, there's new regulation and all around the world. And for my paper, I looked at a recent example, the EU's MiCA regulation, or MiCA, I'm not sure, the markets in crypto assets regulation, where the EU wanted to fill some gaps in its financial regulatory framework. So some types of crypto assets were already covered by existing regulation, but others were not. And so the EU, also driven by the FTX collapse, negotiated this, or the Commission drafted this regulation with the idea of filling gaps and focusing on consumer protection, financial stability, monetary stability. And it's interesting when you go through, or I thought that was interesting, when you go through the regulation, there's actually many indirect references to FTX. It's clear that this MiCA regulation, to a certain extent, was drafted to avoid, or trying to avoid, these spectacular collapses where money of ordinary consumers kind of vanishes in thin air. I won't go into the nitty-gritty of the MiCA regulation, but I wanted to highlight that the scope of the regulation is pretty limited. So it only covers e-money tokens and asset reference tokens, which we all know better as stablecoins. So this is not Bitcoin, but this is tokens that are backed by either fiat currencies or by other types of assets, like gold, for example. So it covers these tokens as well as crypto asset service providers, and it's actually the latter that I'm most interested in. And there's two obligations in the regulation that are of particular interest from a trade law perspective. There's, on the one hand, the local presence requirement, which applies to the e-money tokens, the asset reference tokens, as well as the crypto service suppliers, requiring them to have legal presence in the European Union for them to be able to issue these tokens or to supply the service. The second obligation that is of interest is what I call the issuance restriction. And the obligation basically entails that when a token becomes highly traded, the issuer of that token needs to limit the amount of transactions that are done with that token. So the idea behind that is if one of the tokens that's covered becomes highly traded, that has impact on financial stability. And so there is a cap on how much certain stablecoins can be traded in the EU. Both of these obligations raise questions under international trade law. Local presence requirements have traditionally been considered as potential de facto discriminatory obligations because, or discriminatory requirements, because even though, of course, on the face of it, this is a requirement that applies both to domestic and foreign service suppliers, the additional cost of having local presence only applies to a foreign service supplier, because, of course, the domestic service supplier will always have its local presence, which leads to the conclusion that this local presence requirement can at least be considered preliminarily a discriminatory measure, and thereby potentially violating the EU's obligations under the GATS. The issuance restriction requirement raises questions under the market access obligations because it puts a limit on the service output by the issuers of these tokens, which under Article 16 of the GATS could pose issues. And I'm very, very happy to go into the details of why I think these are potential violations, but that goes beyond what I want to discuss today. What I'd like to focus on today is in conducting this whole analysis of whether there are some issues with these crypto asset regulations under WTO obligations and WTO commitments, is that there's certain challenges that come with conducting this analysis. And I'd like to focus on three. So first of all, the classification of crypto asset services. I won't go into the details of the technicality of the technical analysis that you have to do to classify services under the GATS. Suffice to say that the classification framework that's still being used is very outdated. It's based on a 1993 Secretariat note and a provisional product classification list from the UN that also dates back to the early 90s. So the classification framework is outdated, but that doesn't mean it can't be used. So there's various ways in which classification using this outdated classification framework that, of course, doesn't make any mention of decentralized finance, crypto, or blockchain. But based on the principles of technological neutrality, of evolutionary interpretation of WTO law, there's definitely ways in which classification of crypto asset-related services can be done. But that doesn't mean that classification isn't still contentious and leads to a lot of legal uncertainty and provides WTO members with a lot of wiggle room to kind of say, well, we never agreed to liberalize these kinds of services, so we also can't violate any obligations when it comes to them. Similarly, origin determination is an issue when we're talking about crypto asset regulation. Of course, for the GATS, so the Agreement on Services to apply to any given regulation, there's a requirement that the regulation, of course, affects foreign service suppliers. under trade and services, the origin of the service or the service supplier is based either on the location of the service supplier or on their nationality. So when we're talking about mode 1 or mode 2 in service supply, it's location. Mode 3 or mode 4 is nationality. But again, this is very contentious because how do you determine the location of a crypto asset service supplier? Is it where they have their headquarters? Is it where their servers are located? Is it where the crypto assets are stored? So again, there's this contentious issue with how do you determine the origin of service suppliers? Which you need in order to be able to assess WTO compliance. And then finally, there's such a thing as a prudential carve-out in when it comes to financial services regulation. The prudential carve-out basically provides and I see that I'm running out of time, so I'll wrap it up. Provides WTO members with the leeway to adopt prudential measures to ensure integrity and stability of the financial system. And it's really as broad as that sentence suggests. It's a very broad carve-out. There's discussion on whether it's an exception or an exemption. But it's a very, very broad carve-out that applies to financial services. Question is, does it also apply to crypto assets, crypto asset-related services? Are these financial services in the sense of the prudential carve-out? There's many valid policy considerations for this type of regulation, right? Consumer protection, financial stability. There's many good reasons to try to regulate crypto or the trade in crypto and crypto-related services, but there's also protectionism, and it's a thin line. So how do you walk that? I'll leave it at this because the final remark that I just wanted to mention is that these are only 3 issues that I kind of identified in conducting my analysis of WTO compliance of this one specific crypto regulation. But I wanted to raise the question, and I'm still not sure what the answer is. What role the WTO has to play in all of this? I do think there's a need for further clarification. I think the WTO could play an important role in that, and I do invite the members to start thinking about this a little bit more also. And I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Very cool. So we have about 35 minutes or so. We were thinking, we have 2 colleagues in the back with microphones. For those, I'm California. I've never been told I talk too quiet, right? So, but we have 2 microphones in the back that they can pass around. Well, here it is. And I thought maybe we could take 2 or 3 questions and then see where it goes from there. Would that make sense? Okay, cool.
Oh, hello. Yeah. I'm Gustavo Prieto from Ghent University. Thanks to all panelists. I will be very brief with the question. The first one, I have two questions. The first one for Andrea. For your proposition, you mentioned this argument that the protocol, the code itself, is the institution, which is very interesting because it entails like a constitution, like some kind of quasi-constitutional nature. And I'm wondering, once this form of government has to interact with a broader social field, how to conceptualize rights, and especially human rights, inside of this new political code arrangement? Can we still speak about human rights or rights in general? How should we term it? Or probably we need to have a new conceptual category to kind of equate what we built for so many years in the system of human rights into what the code system based of protocol might be. So I would like to know your point on this. And a second question that I think touches to the presentations of Nea and Ines. I think that one of the big issues both on interoperability and WTO law is a problem of lexicological standards. As you mentioned, there are different semantic ways, different taxonomies. of how to call these new products. Some like crypto assets, fiat currency, cryptocurrency. So there are so many terms. There's a new vocabulary that is emerging. The question is, who should be the one setting the standards, the lexicological standards, the vocabulary for this new technology? Should we keep trusting on international standardization communities such as ISO or ITU, or there should be some kind of other mechanism to set the vocabulary that will allow technical interoperability and also the insertion of these terms into a treaty system like WTO? Thanks.
Maybe we take another one or two more questions.
Hi, Marcus Wagner at the University of Wollongong and Executive Vice President of ESIL. So, Andrea, I have a question for you, and it sort of follows up from what we just heard. And it's actually sort of an informational question, right? To what extent would you actually say that they're beyond, say, sort of denying that we don't want to live in that state world, right? That fiat currency world and so forth. Has there been some actual real sort of deep thinking about what that they actually want is, right? In the crypto world, and how governance in that world should work, right? So everyone knows this sort of origin story of Sashimoto and blah, 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 but there must be more than just sort of that. And so I'm interested in whether you can tell a story, maybe not the story, because I'm sure there's plenty of different stories that one can tell about that, and how that then relates to the world that we might live in, right? Because it sort of reminds me a little bit of all these contestations we have from the likes of Elon Musk, that basically just wants to shun all the world that we have, and we just let the Tesla cars run wild. That's one model of doing it, or there's simulated models, and people don't get killed nearly as often, right? So it's sort of, what is that underlying world? Neha, you're trying to sort of thread a needle, it seems like, right? We're on the one hand, we're having this world that gets more and more siloed, where standards, global standards are seemingly either hard to come by or impossible to do, because it's a bottom-up approach versus bottom-up and versus the opposite. Sorry, long day or short night. And so how do you thread that needle when there's attempts to do almost the exact opposite at times, right? So is this interoperability even foreseen to be desirable, or do we live in this siloed world where there's some interoperability but not really wanted, or not being able to be delivered by the way that infrastructure is being done, if that makes sense? And Ines, I will come up with a question later on for you potentially. Maybe just that. Sort of similar to that, we're trying, again, the crypto world is trying to do something outside of sort of what the orthodox governance world among states has created. And so is the WTO, which I think is the right forum, don't get me wrong, I don't think the IMF is the answer, that they are doing something else. And as long as we're staying in the service lane, I think that's the place to be. But does crypto even want to be, or was crypto designed just not to be governed by institutions like the WTO? Right, and therefore you're not asking the wrong but the wrong questions for the people that don't want to be regulated.
Thanks so much. Why don't we just go down the line with our panelists, and then we'll do another round?
Okay, super. Thanks for the questions. And I think they are really connected. As you said, they build on each other. So the question of what does it mean if the protocol becomes the institution? And I mean, of course, this is only part of the story, no? But there is inscribing into the protocol to a degree that wasn't available before, in the sense of the tokenization and the way that the token allocation works. And you can do voting in the token with the token infrastructure and so on. So the protocol has, I think, more bones than in other institutional setups as it is encoded like this. But of course, that's only a part of the story, and this whole big question of on-chain governance, off-chain governance, what does that mean? Where does governance really take place? Is one that I think everyone very fairly clearly understands. Obviously, there is deliberation, there is off-chain governance, there are mechanisms that have to be in place on top of that to connect. And I think that what you are asking about, what would it mean to think through human rights in this or something like that, I think that's one of the key issues in the whole conceptualization of legal thought in the crypto space. And I think this goes also to your question of what is it concretely that people are thinking about, because there is a very ahistorical sense of how a society could be a better society. So even in the very commons-oriented left projects, you would still have a bit this idea that you do justice by design, if I may call it like this, and that there is no account of social struggle that needs to come before that, or that is part of that. No, I mean, to again go very pathetic with James Baldwin, freedom is never given, it's always taken. So there is no accounting for this kind of legal thinking, which I think human rights show that this is how things move forward. On the other hand, because it's not ingrained in economic structures as the state apparatus is so deeply, there is a much bigger possibility to develop economic relations that are based on different kinds of working with each other, because the token economy can be designed in so many different ways and has a volume that can operate outside of this. So I think on the economic side, there's a lot of opening because of the token proposition. On the right side and on the human rights side, there's a lot of problems.
I should use mine. Okay. I also have a very loud voice, so I was thinking of skipping the microphone because it's a little scary to hear your own voice sometimes so loudly. So thank you for your questions. So to the first question, actually I was very brief in my presentation, but a lot of my paper actually looks at what you're asking, which is who is setting the vocabulary, how is this vocabulary being set, what are the mechanisms? And I completely agree with you that this can be quite difficult, because a very simple example I mentioned in the paper is what's the definition of personal data. That vocabulary is often, very varied across countries and sometimes across stakeholders. So the way, for instance, an engineer might identify personally identifiable information might be very different from the way a regulator in that country, say the data protection authority within that country, might be looking at it. There are certain ideas that I propose in the paper. So I briefly mentioned about the modular approach, which would essentially mean breaking down and so for the whole project of regulatory interoperability that I propose is not a grand project, but actually consists of many, many small elements. And the idea is for each of these elements, it's important to get in the right experts in. And in certain instances, there would be civil society bodies or technical bodies or standard setting bodies or multi-stakeholder bodies, and not necessarily a state regulator or international bodies or a multilateral body. So for that kind of, for the different kinds of institutions and networks that need to be tapped into for different issues, I propose that as a solution. But yes, it is imperfect in the sense that these are building blocks. There are different building blocks that you need to think about, and then you also need to think about how they work with each other. And therefore, I don't think this is going to be a perfect alignment of sorts. It's going to be experimental with a lot of trying and testing. But I think this is better than not doing anything at all and letting things fragment even further and creating more legal business and policy uncertainty. I think that is less desirable according to me. But yeah, it's a very valid question. And Professor Wagner's question that I'm trying to thread the needle, is it desirable? Is it wanted? Does the infrastructure support it? I had a lot of discussions with people who work in the government who actually see a lot of value in figuring out ways of regulatory interoperability when it comes to digital trade. And that kind of inspired me to investigate where it actually already is working in some form, or at least there's some attempt being made to shape it. So I think it's definitely desirable, especially if you zoom out of EU, US, and some of the big powers. Most of the other countries are really interested to engage meaningfully. So from that perspective, I think there's normative value to exploring this. I think there's also policy value, because a lot of industry players, and mind you, this is more about smaller players than bigger players, would benefit if we had more interoperable structures. There are certain areas that I identify in my paper, for instance, critical information infrastructure, which is one of those areas where perhaps interoperability is not desirable, at least not until we have some consensus on, to begin with the vocabulary, what is critical information infrastructure, because that can really vary across countries. But there are also many positive developments, and they are not spectacularly huge, but I'll give you one example, which is under digital economy agreements, which it's mostly Asia-Pacific countries who are engaging with it, but now UK and some of the other countries, EU is also now discussing with Singapore. They have figured out more informal ways of dealing with these problems. So just as an example, to deal with some of the problems of digital standards, in the Australia-Singapore Digital Economy Agreement, instead of using a treaty-based mechanisms, they are using MOUs to deal with many aspects which relate very much to technical and regulatory interoperability. And one might be skeptical and say that, well, these are small, minute, granular solutions, but you've got to start somewhere. And I really think that if we engaged in a more detailed regulatory mapping, we would find more areas of intersection where there could be more, and it could be sector specific, it could be issue specific, but again, as I said, I think that's better than a fully fragmented and divided world. So it's a positive message, I guess, of some sorts.
Thank you so much for the questions. It's not easy to try to thread these very different presentations together with questions, so thank you so much. To build a little bit, I don't have much to add to what Nia has said about your question on who should set the vocabulary and the standards to discuss these types of things. To be frank, I don't care where it gets done, as long as it gets done. I think we're also in geopolitical times where we have to be pragmatic. Whatever the forum, as long as we can get countries, whether that's regulators, whether that's technical people, whether that's civil society, together to kind of agree on, okay, like what's the baseline, what's the vocabulary that we'll use, for example, to regulate crypto. I would say that's the main thing. I don't have an answer as to where the ideal place would be to do this. I think any place where members or countries are willing to come together. When it comes to the question whether crypto is designed not to be regulated by the WTO, I mean, maybe I should first confess that I'm a crypto skeptic, not the technology. I think the technology is amazing and has a lot of potential, but I am a skeptic of the ideals, or I don't subscribe to them. I'll put it like that. I think, I mean, what kind of lawyer would I be if I want something to not be regulated at all because it can kind of self-regulate? I think as long as we see these risks play out in society, where the risks cannot be addressed by the technology itself or by the structure that it currently has or the way in which it's being used, I think that there's a place for regulation. And as soon as there's domestic regulation, there's a role for the WTO to be played. And a role to be played to clarify, to work towards regulatory interoperability, and to make sure that we have, or at least globally we agree on the basics, on the general obligations that apply to this type of regulation. So I'm sure the crypto people would say no regulation, neither domestically, nor at the WTO, but I disagree. As long as they don't get their shit together, I think regulators need to step in.
Round two. I think we have two people here and then Thomas in the front.
Thank you. Luis Hinojosa from the University of Granada. And my question goes for Ines. If I understood you well, you said that the two conditions, though there are many other conditions in the MiCA regulation, but the two conditions that you thought may have problems with WTO law are local presence requirement and the issuance restriction. But I would tend to think that these two conditions are very easily justified under WTO law, under the public order exception. I mean, it's in many financial services, you need local presence, and to limit the number of tokens that can be issued when they could threaten financial stability can also be easily justified on the grounds of the public order restriction. In the gambling case, the panel was very clear when it established that anything that had to do with money laundering, fraud, or underage gambling, or this kind of issues was easily justified under the public order exception. So if you have doubts, I don't know if I understood you well, if you have doubt with the compatibility of these two conditions with WTO law, which are your doubts? Because I'm curious to know. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I would like to continue. My first question is to Andrea. I mean, the whole idea of self-governing communities, it has strong appeal and so on, but if something is getting wrong, I think that many people, they would love to see the political Leviathan coming to help us. Let's say if someone, she put all her pension funds money on Bitcoins and she lost everything. I think first time, of course, she would go to her government in order to have something to live on. And in such cases, I guess that many people would be complaining about their government. You didn't regulate it? Yeah, how is it? Somebody should take care of us. So perhaps there is also some expectation to have a kind of safety net in terms of regulations. Yeah, and to Ines, just small comment again. I think that it may well be regulated by the special agreement under the GATS on financial services. Actually, we are talking here on financial services, no? I mean, it's kinds of financial assets. And I think that legal presence, it is legal, if I'm not mistaken.
We have one more question in the back, and then Thomas in the front.
Andre Lang, European University Viadrina from Germany. My question goes to Ines and kind of tries to tackle the issue whether the WTO should regulate crypto from a different angle. And kind of my question concerns legal, like what's the best legal strategy in the current institutional environment that the WTO finds itself in? If you talk to some legal scholars from the US with close connections to the US government, I mean, they say that the WTO is dead. I mean, I don't necessarily subscribe to this statement, but I think it's no overemphasis to say that the WTO is an existential crisis, and that raises the question then for panelists on WTO dispute settlement panels, or for trade lawyers in ministerial bureaucracies or diplomatic context in Geneva. What's the best strategy? And it seems to me you've outlined that, I mean, kind of the legal framework that would apply to crypto is quite outdated, so it would require creative and teleological interpretation kind of to fit crypto under this framework. So I wonder whether kind of a more promising strategy is to focus on consolidating what undisputably falls under WTO law and kind of these new technologies that raise kind of have a geopolitical dimension, kind of like rather kind of to avoid those rather than engaging in a kind of a creative and teleological interpretation.
Thank you so much, Thomas Strines. Amazing panel. So I have a question for each of you. To Ines, following up on the other questions we just heard, I was really curious about the relationship between your analysis that seemed to be very focused on the GATS with international investment law as another area of international economic law, and whether you think they push in the same direction in terms of what they protect and how they deal with the regulatory authority of states. And relatedly, because you were so focused on the WTO law that we have, I was wondering if you have any thoughts about crypto asset regulation in future trade agreements, so whether it's digital economy agreements or regional initiatives, because that's where the action seems to be. So if you could draft that such an agreement, would you advocate for crypto asset specific provisions that would maybe clarify some of the issues that you highlighted? To Niha, I of course love that take on interoperability, taking this computer science concept. And I think I have two reactions. One is that in the interoperability, on the question of regulatory interoperability, it seems that one issue is that regulators don't always want to interoperate. And the question is, what can law do about that? So you can build institutions, you can have certain legal requirements, but is there more that one could do to create communities? And what kind of people would you need to get into the room to achieve that kind of social component, cultural component of interoperability? And then there's always the flip side. So do you see any areas, any constellations in which we might want non-interoperability? Because in computer science, we don't always want interoperability. Sometimes we want to air gap our computer for it to not get infected. So do you see constellations where that's also true in the regulatory space? And then for Andrea, I mean, it's such a generative project. I was really intrigued by the different network states and the different interests, the different imaginations, the different futures. And I was wondering if you could say a bit more about their relationships. So do they see themselves as parts of the same network project, network state project, despite those differences in their configurations, interests, and imaginations? Or do they fight against each other? Because that's where we would expect international law or a new kind of international law to play a role as a kind of inter-network state law, as an inter-network public law. Or would you expect, or are there examples for that it's not actually law that regulates relationships between the network states, but some kind of code?
Thank you so much for these questions. I'll try to run through all of them, but if I miss something, just please call me out on it. So when it comes to the first question about justification under Article 14 of the GATS, I covered this in the paper. I didn't go into it today because I was only allocated 15 minutes and I already went over my time. Indeed, I do think if this measure would be challenged, the EU would say, well, we can justify this, whether it's under the public order justification or not. I do think there is room to push back on a general exceptions justification. The necessity requirement does ask to look at whether there's less trade restrictive alternatives available. And I do think there is some room to argue that the thresholds that are being set by the EU could be seen as arbitrary. When it comes to the issuance requirement, for example, to what extent? I mean, what I'm trying to say is the threshold for the EU would be significant, I think, to justify saying that as soon as a token exceeds daily transactions, so 1 million daily transactions or 200 million euro value in daily transactions, that's when it becomes an issue for public order, for example. So that's one thing. I think there is some room to push back under the necessity test. And secondly, I do think I do wonder whether in these kinds of analyses we should take into account the MiCA agreement as a whole, or the MiCA regulation as a whole, because the agreement, when you look at all of the obligations, there's so many, there's many obligations that apply to these, for example, crypto asset service suppliers, where the sum of all of these requirements already meets kind of the policy objective of protecting public order. So my question there, or my concern there is, is this killing by overregulation? And could you then argue that the EU wouldn't need these two specific obligations in order to meet its public order objectives? But of course, I mean, I agree completely, up for debate, and there would definitely be pushback. But I do think there's some room to argue that these measures are not necessarily justifiable under Article 14 of the GATS. When it comes to whether crypto asset services are financial services and therefore covered by the annex on financial services and all of the provisions that we have, I would say yes. I agree that these are financial services and thus covered by the provisions that we have on financial services. But this is not a given nor necessarily accepted amongst WTO members. When it comes to the classification of any types of digital service, WTO members have pushed back, have said, we have negotiated our commitments in 1995 or any of the years after, whenever we joined the WTO. These types of services didn't exist. We're dealing with a negative list, so we don't consider these new services, no matter how alike they are in terms of their function, to be covered by our existing commitments. And that is also the reason why I think there's a need for clarification. There's a need for WTO members in an ideal world to come together and say, yes, crypto, for example, we do consider financial services and all of the existing obligations apply. Obligations and safeguards, like the prudential carve-out. When it comes to the question on whether the WTO is dead, it has an existential crisis, and what's the best way forward. I think ideally you don't want to leave this to dispute settlement because it's too contentious. I think WTO members would, I mean, there's a reason why we see so little WTO or challenges of digital regulation at the WTO. It's a can of worms and no one wants to open it. So ideally, we don't go to dispute settlement over this. Ideally, we get a multilateral agreement negotiated by all WTO members. I don't think there's a need for a separate agreement. I would much more than argue for a crypto asset agreement at the WTO. I would much prefer to see an understanding on the position of cryptocurrencies under WTO law, where members just agree, we consider decentralized finance, we consider this to be part of financial services as we understood it under the GATS so far, and that's how we'll regulate it going forward. Is this wishful thinking? I agree, absolutely, but I think we shouldn't give up on the WTO as a relevant forum, and I think we can dream when we're on panels like this. So I would say, ideally, we do something like that. And I think my answer to the final question, because I see time is running out, what I would draft in FTAs when it comes to cryptocurrency. In my research so far, also when I looked into digital services, I very much further the idea that I don't think that we need to have specific provisions. I think the WTO framework as it was negotiated originally is wonderful because it's based on principles. Let's go back to the principles. Let's just clarify what we already have and build on that. So I would say multilateralism over regionalism or bilateralism, and preferably let's clarify what we already have. I think that's the most constructive way forward, also considering that all of these things will keep developing. Now we're talking about cryptocurrency and blockchain. Who knows what we'll be talking about in 10, 15 years. So I'd say don't overcomplicate by having too much specific regulation. Thank you very much.
So the question, to respond to Thomas's question, I actually started the other way around, thinking of areas where there can be interoperability, where regulators desire interoperability, and where it has some value add. So I like the fact that you flipped the question and made it a little tough for me. So I think it's a very interesting question. When regulators think that there is no value to interoperate, even if you do have a legal framework, it may not have that much value. On the other hand, even if you don't have a legal framework, if regulators want to interoperate, they will find another way out. So I think the social, cultural mechanism that you're talking about is quite important. One thing, I was very brief in my presentation, but I think transnational policy networks are very important. Two examples I mentioned are OECD and ICN. And the reason why I picked these two is because I could see a lot of work they have done being gradually put into trade agreements or other legal documents. So just to give you an example, some of the rules on principles on competition and some of the guidelines on good regulatory practices that come from these bodies have actually been incorporated into trade treaties, which shows that they are actually becoming a part of the legal culture as well, not just the policy culture. In terms of interoperability, again, another example I could think of, which I briefly discussed in the paper as well, is the OECD Declaration on Data, Governmental Access to Data. Basically, again, just being a high-level declaration, nothing binding, but gradually governments are now seeing whether those principles can become a part of their legal relationship as well. So perhaps that's one avenue that is really untapped in international economic law, because there's somewhat of an allergy to engage with these institutions, and I think that can be meaningful. In terms of the areas where there cannot, again, be interoperability, I haven't delved into this in much detail. As I said, I started the other way around, but I mentioned critical information infrastructure as one of the tricky areas. I also sometimes find it very difficult to reconcile this whole adequacy regime with the more accountability-based regime in data protection law. I haven't still been able to find my way around it, but I think there are countries who want to figure out a way around that as well. And digital identities is another area where I think there's a lot of discussion on interoperable digital identity system, but there are many risks, including national security risks that come with it. And I would be, if I was, I know Australia and Singapore have signed an agreement where they talk about interoperable digital identities. I would be careful if they were signing this agreement, with a lot of other countries, because it can have national security repercussions.
Okay, maybe then just briefly, and I think, I don't remember the name, but the question of, we don't need regulation. There needs to be some regulation. Someone wants to be able to call the police, no, if something is done. So I think, really to be very clear, I think that, so the proposition is not against regulation in any way. I think that the question from where I'm coming from is a bit, there is a scholar in crypto, his name is Nathan Schneider, and he said it very nicely, we are asking too much of the state. This is the starting point. And I think also in James Scott's book here, there is not a proposition of saying do away with the state and that's it, but there is the question of where do we think of socially and societally coming together and organize in ways that allow to collectively secure a future that sit within, without, and somewhere around the state apparatus. And I mean, I think this is something that very much is also in collectives that are trying to do commoning, no, which is also as old as age. But this question of between the market and the state, what kind of governance modalities can be tapped into, commoning and commons comes as one of the biggest ideas, and it is really meant as not being a state-driven thing. It's also not meant to be only market-driven, and it's a big deal in the let's say progressive crypto world. People are really taking Eleanor Ostrom's work almost like a Bible. And really, there is an attempt of doing this, and the token economics allow to do at scale what otherwise is much harder to do at scale. I'm still not saying it's possible to do it at scale, but much more likely, and there's a new affordance that allows this, that gives this more juice. And so I think that when I look at other projects, like libertarian projects, that are really extreme, there's a project in which wonderfully my research world has come full circle. I worked on the history of investment law. So now there is a community in Honduras on Roatan, Prospera, they are called, very nicely, who have been granted a special economic zone right under the previous government, and now this new socialist government is taking back these rights, and Prospera has launched an exit claim that is currently pending for 10 billion. And so this question also, I think, comes back to your very original question with Musk and Thiel and these ideas of we do it from the scratch, everything is terra nullius. Exactly, that's a bit where I think the important division is, that you have projects that have an extremely neo-colonial character that say, yeah, let's go buy property everywhere and make a new state and just pretend everything is fresh. But I do think that then the other side of this are these commoning projects, now where you have already socialities, you have already communities, you have things that are trying to build something. And the question is, can the technological affordances of blockchain offer something to do that at a bigger scale and in a more significant way? So this is, I would say, and then to your question, Thomas, with the what's the relationship between these projects to each other? It's one of the most interesting things because it was such a small space. You know, I think it's very nice you say the crypto people would say, and I have heard this so often, so I have come to say I'm a crypto people. Because so people know each other well for a long time. It's a small community. And of course, there are extremely big fault lines in the political aspirations, but there is still a possibility for communication in many ways because you just know and you, but here now the big battle is out when it comes to the interoperability. One chain to rule them all, maybe, I don't know. Polkadot wanted to do the big relay chain interoperability. It was too complex, too advanced, too slow. They didn't put it out soon enough. Other projects have come in. So there is a battle a bit, and there is a friendship a bit. So it goes in both directions, I think. And just to say that as a very final note, what I didn't speak about at all in the talk, but I think from an international law perspective, what you mentioned, there is a lot to be said about how do you create places of encounter between different communities so that they can coexist. International law is the prime discipline, I think, in order to think about this and construe this also for such things that don't have to be state or non-state. They can be a bit of both, but these places of encounter, this is what we can think about in a good way.